Hello, this is Larry Kane, one of 3 broadcasters traveling with the Beatles. At this moment, we're flying across the American Midwest. We're right over Kansas, about 23,000 feet in the air, on the Beatles chartered airliner on our way to Cincinnati, one of the stops on this exciting 25-city coast-to-coast tour. The boys are heading east, following 7 electrifying performances on the West Coast. And now, 4,000 miles away from you, the guests of Melody Maker, here is John Lennon.
Hello people, this is John Lennon. I'm thanking you for the award, which I can't see. Hope you had a nice dinner. I'm travelling as one of the 40 guests with all these broadcasters. Thank you again. Here's Paul.
No rain or anything. And that's about it. All the best. Thanks again.
Boys, thank you. This is Larry Kane with the Beatles flying across America.
Like a lot of teenagers in Liverpool, you know, when the rock and roll or e.g., you know, folk scene or skiffle, whatever it was, and the records getting started playing on the radio, you know, I was captivated by the music, the sounds that were coming out, and I suppose that culminated and came to real fruition when my mother opened the Casbah, you know, in '59, even though the music scene had been on long before that. I mean, Liverpool was always a hotbed for music, you know, even before, you know, the 50s, you know, and even the 40s, big band, jazz, you name it, it came from Liverpool.
I was in, like a lot of teenagers, to people like Cliff Richard, Johnny Layton, Mike Sarn, Mark Winter, Elvis Presley, and of course great Liverpudlian was Billy Fury, Ronald Wycherley. And it was sort of lovely music, but certainly the British acts tended to be what I would call very middle of the road.
Like most kids in Liverpool, started off on a guitar. I wasn't comfy with it, right? It was just like, yeah, fine, did the usual 3 chords, and like, nah, I'm not getting the hang of this too good. Drumming, I was banging pots, tables, this, that, and the other, right? That's my scene, that, you know, so watching old movies with Gene Krupa on, became captivated being drums, and then actually seeing drums getting paid in the cellar by different bands from Liverpool. When the opportunity came to actually form a band, it was like, I want to be the drummer. Or they would turn around and say, you are going to be the drummer. And that's how I got involved. You know, started off with a little band called the Blackjacks, which played the Casbah and the local scene, and then of course, the rest is history in a way.
In the beginning, the Beatles were a skiffle group. They sort of emerged from that particular era, and that was a time when sort of anything went, and it was a time when sort of people, the more sort of homegrown your sound, the better, which is why a lot of skiffle groups tended to use instruments made out of household implements, like the sort of tea chest bass, which was just essentially a tea chest, a broomstick and a piece of string. Later on, skiffle became very passé, and the former skiffle groups tended to acquire either fell by the wayside, or they tended to acquire amplification and abandon their old sort of Lonnie Donegan repertoire and sort of concentrate more on sort of classic rock.
And then along came the Mersey scene, including the Beatles. But I think we've got to remember as well, at that time there were at least 400 bands in Liverpool, of which, I've heard the figure of 800, but we'll say at least 400, of which the Beatles were just one band. And they weren't the number one band at that time. And they were appearing here at the Cavern, these bands, and the Beatles were one. Who first appeared here in 1957 as the Quarrymen. Now, I don't know if you're familiar, but at that time as well in Liverpool in the late 50s, it wasn't particularly a rock scene, it was a jazz scene. And this club, the Cavern, was named after a famous jazz club in Paris called La Kevo. And the Quarrymen came on here, and suddenly John Lennon belted out into a rock number. Well, there was uproar in here, not delirious uproar, but anger from these jazz aficionados and the management, who told him to shut up, don't play that sort of music, or you'll never get another booking here.
Long before the Cavern, even when the Cavern was a jazz cellar, right? The Casbah was thriving as a rock and roll club, and I think that's what we emphasise when we're talking to people about the music scene in Liverpool. But her idea was she wanted to bring music to the kids, which wasn't happening in coffee bars in Liverpool. I actually got to know them then as the Quarrymen, because the band that, the old story, the band that should have opened it, the Les Stewart Quartet, broke up a couple of weeks beforehand. And Ken Brown and George Harrison, who had actually seen playing Lowlands in the Les Stewart Quartet, came down and saw my mother Mona and turned around and said, "Mo, we got bad news for you. The band has broken up." And of course it was like, my God, we got a couple of weeks to opening night, what are we going to do, what are we going to do? And George turned around and said, I happen to know a couple of guys who aren't doing anything at the present moment, and maybe they're interested, because it was going to be a residency, and residencies for a young band was like gold in those days. So my mother turned around and said, in her infinite wisdom, bring them down the next day. And lo and behold, who landed up? John Lennon and Paul McCartney.
In those days, they used to hang about as coffee bar layabouts. I can still see now Paul, John, and John was having toast, and he wanted jam on the toast. And Paul telling Muff, said, "John, you must be mad. It's a penny extra." Now look at Paul here. Would eat about a penny extra for jam on the toast.
They were rather a clumsy group before they went to Hamburg. The group boiled down essentially to John, Paul and George, and with various drummers. They didn't sort of have any sort of drummer that they seemed to be able to hold on to for very long. They had a bass player. They managed to get one of John's colleagues at art college to buy a bass. He wasn't a particularly good bass player, Stuart Sutcliffe.
But he was coerced into becoming a member of the Beatles. Got his arm twisted, which took place here, in the coffee bar next door. And it was a conversation. He'd won his John Moore's exhibition, he had 50 or 60 quid. And of course they needed a bass player. And he was the guy, buy a bass and you can join the band, we'll teach you how to play.
I didn't even know they were a group. I had a coffee bar club named the Jacaranda downtown. And I remember having a problem with the ladies' toilets next door, because we shared it with a shop next door which sold candy. And the ladies had to share our toilets. And because of the obscene graffiti that the girls used to, scroll on the wall about the private parts of Beatles and whatever, or any other groups, I had to get the toilets redecorated. And in those days, two guys that used to hang around as coffee bar layabouts was John Lennon and Stuart Sutcliffe. There were 5 Beatles in my days. And knowing they were from the art school, I said, I've got a job for you lads. And I said, yeah, what, Alan? I said, will you decorate the ladies' toilets? Which they did. So the first money that ever changed hands between me and the Beatles was decorating the ladies' toilet. Actually, when they'd finished, I preferred the graffiti.
They were offered a season in Hamburg clubland, providing they could find somebody to sort of sit behind the kit. And it happened that Pete Best was available, that he was reasonably competent, and he actually owned a drum kit. And so, after the most cursory audition, he was in.
It wasn't like auditioning for a new band. It was like auditioning for a gang of mates. We were all playing the same music. We'd all done the same thing. We'd all played the same clubs. It was just the fact that they were one of the first bands to go out to Germany, and they asked me.
But in those days, they were that broke, they hadn't got the fare to go over. And as I loved Hamburg, it was a good excuse for me to get to Hamburg on the Reeperbahn again. And so I drove them there.
Alan was responsible for it and taking us out. And as he always turned around and said, he smuggled us into Hamburg the first time. We didn't know we had to have papers and work permits and all that type of thing. It was just very much a case of your students, leave it up to me and we'll get in there.
It made them because, when they got there, they were put in really seedy accommodation.
I think we'd all, even though not many of us talked about it, I think we'd all had a little parental chat before we got on the bus. And it was the usual thing. I can imagine each parent saying the same thing. You're going to Hamburg, be careful. We didn't know what Hamburg was going to be like. We knew it was a port. Liverpool was a port. But when we actually got there and we hit the Reeperbahn, right, that was absolutely incredible. You got to imagine we were 17, 18-year-olds. And we had this maze of neon lights which just stretched the whole, whatever the Reeperbahn's length is, 1.5 miles or something like that. It made Blackpool Illuminations look, like a little fairy town. It was heaving. The crowd was out, the atmosphere was out. And of course we suddenly realised that this was St. Pauli. This was the red light district of the world. And the more we got to know it, and we found out where we were playing, the hours that we had to play, it became a second home to us. St. Pauli, even though it was the red light district of the world, it was our playground. And that's what we loved about the place. We were all fond of having a drink, and women were abundant, and we were healthy young lads. We enjoyed ourselves, It was a case of having to. When you look at it, to be quite honest, it sounds, you go back and you think about it. And we were doing things which by today's standards are most probably any blatant stuff. It was like a boy's own. But to us in those days, okay, drinking and orgies was like, this is rock and roll, man. We're in the middle of Hamburg. We're in the red light district. We've got women fawning over us left, right and centre from every walk of life. From high class prostitutes down to, the homely girl on the street. That was the audience. That was the calibre of audience who we were playing to. And we enjoyed ourselves. It was long hours. We had to let off steam. And, we did what we felt was right. We enjoyed ourselves.
They had to work punishing hours, and it became necessary for them to sort of expand their repertoire.
It was hard. Goodness me. I think when we first got there and we turned around and said, where are we playing? And we thought we were going to be playing in the Kaiserkeller, and of course we weren't. We were playing in the Grotte Old Indra, down at the bottom end of the Grosse Freiheit, and we, the challenge was you've got to turn this into a second Kaiserkeller, which we did. And then we got it shut down because we were playing too loud, but that's another story, so to speak. But I suppose when we got there and we said, where are we playing and how long are we playing? and we were told you're playing 7 hours a night, 15 minutes off every hour. It was a hell of a challenge because no one from Liverpool had played those hours before. And I was like, okay, that is a bit of a challenge. How do we do it, right? So we built ourselves up.
Certainly up until 1962, the Beatles weren't really playing any of their own material at all. There'd be a very, very occasional Lennon-McCartney original, but 99% of their stuff would have been covers of American rock and roll hits and R&B hits, plus an occasional ballad like they used to do Wooden Heart, the Elvis song, just one for the girls, but almost entirely that set was things like What I Say and Johnny Be Good, those kind of Chuck Berry, Ray Charles, Jerry Lee Lewis songs.
What we were doing at that time was basically covers. Most of the bands in Liverpool were doing covers, which ranged from Little Richards to Chuck Berry, the Everly Brothers, you name it, right? We were fortunate in as much that, with the scale of voices we had, they were very good, harmony-wise. Each singer had their own identity. John was Chuck Berry and Gene Vincent, Paul was Little Richard, Ray Charles, George was Carl Perkins, Eddie Cochran, all this type of stuff. So they were the songs that we were playing. That's what we cut our teeth on.
If there are better ways of breaking in a group, then I can't think of any. I mean, you either, survived Hamburg and you came out of it, able to sort of cope with lesser tasks in Britain, or else it destroyed you. And it nearly destroyed the Beatles. It nearly destroyed the Beatles because of an altercation they had with the club owner, Bruno Koschmider, because he discovered that they were actually, in the breaks in their very punishing schedule every night, they're actually going over to a rival club and actually getting up on stage and performing there. He didn't like that, and he didn't like it even less when the rival club owner actually tried to, steal the Beatles from him, actually transfer them to the other club. And so he, he'd hear about what they were doing and he'd say, it's good, and which in a tone which said it wasn't. And he took very great measures to ensure that they would never work in Hamburg again. He discovered that George Harrison was actually a minor at the time and shouldn't be working in a red light district after midnight, which he had been doing. And so he arranged for George to be deported. And next up, there was a trumped up charge of arson, which was levelled at Pete Best and Paul McCartney, and they were deported as well. And that was more or less the finish of their first season in Hamburg. I mean, it ended very ignominiously, but it had hidden benefits, because by the time they returned to Liverpool, they were an absolutely peerless live act.
What the Beatles learnt in Hamburg was, number one, stamina, number two, self-confidence, and I think number three, arrogance. They had to perform huge long sets. I mean, they would get 5 minutes off every hour or something, but they would start at something like 4 in the afternoon and still be playing at 2 in the morning. Now, the only way they could do that was to take large quantities of pep pills and large quantities of drink, and to make every song last for a long time. Now, if you're going to be in that kind of situation, you have to believe in what you're doing. They were very much like the last gang in town in Hamburg. They were a very, very close-knit group. There was almost nobody else there who spoke English, I think. And so they're very much thrown back on themselves, and they got that very tight-knit collective feeling, which enabled them then to go on and conquer the world. But in musical terms, they learnt how to command a crowd. They learnt how to pull people in off the street and to keep them there.
We conquered Hamburg as far as we were concerned. Right, that was, we'd done 4 months there, should have been a month. We were kicked out on the way back. We came back, reformed. Lifeline was thrown here at the Casbah, 19th of December. This is where Beatlemania started, at the Casbah. Okay. Regardless of what other people turn around and say, some people turn around and say it was Littleton Town Hall on the 27th. It wasn't. Mo gave them a lifeline, and the first gig they did in Liverpool on the return back from Hamburg was here. It seemed funny actually, because it always ended up the first gig we came back from Hamburg and the last gig before we went to Hamburg was always the Casbah. Wasn't planned that way, but when you look back in hindsight, it happened. But that particular night, the first night the Beatles played here, the reaction from the Liverpool audiences, you couldn't move in here. Right? There were kids squashed on the ceilings. Health and safety didn't exist. right, as far as we were concerned then. And the word went out on the street, and you know, the next time they played in Liverpool, it was just, got to go and see the Beatles.
They came back to Liverpool a completely different outfit than the one that had gone to Germany. And their first appearance back in Liverpool when they came back from Hamburg, official appearance, was at a place called Litherland Town Hall, although they had played at the Casbah Club, which was Pete Best's home. And they were advertised in the Liverpool Echo as the Beatles straight from Germany. Now, a lot of local Liverpool people, teenagers, thought they were a German band because they weren't that well known before they actually went to Germany. And they turned up at Litherland Town Hall. The place was packed. And they turned up there expecting to see this new band, a German band. And of course the Beatles came on. The four lads, five lads actually, who'd gone out to Germany, they'd seen in Liverpool before. And there was a few sort of gasps of, oh, no, not them. And yet their act had been completely transformed.
People in Liverpool couldn't understand it. How, you know, this group, who people didn't think much of, suddenly come back, and they were brilliant, all in black leather and everything, you know. And they had all the other groups like King Size, Taylor Fan and Flamingos watching them, completely astounded, you know. And Pete Best had developed this atom beat, you know, which created this fantastic sound.
And within about 6 weeks of these gigs, they were playing in really tawdry ballrooms. After about 6 weeks, they were absolutely chock-a-block, absolutely full to the rafters with people enjoying themselves. This, because it wasn't new, but it was different from, you know, what was happening with anybody else.
For a start, they looked good. They were dressed in Hamburg leathers. You know, from head to from shoulders to feet, and also that they actually sort of were very much more direct. There was no messing about. There was no sort of, you know, fiddling around, you know, playing half a verse then stopping and doing something else. Also, they had this attitude where it seemed anybody watching them got the feeling that they couldn't care less about the audience, and they were up there having fun amongst themselves. And I think that, you know, the fact that their enjoyment of being there actually came over very well. And also had this sort of very almost lackadaisical attitude. They used to smoke cigarettes on stage. They used to sort of, you know, belch into the microphone. A lot, in fact, I mean, there's quite a strong parallel between them and when the Sex Pistols first turned up in 1976. You know, it was that sort of thing. You know, it was outrageous, really.
I think Hamburg was we needed to go back. And I think the reason for it was, yeah, we could have stayed in Liverpool, right? We'd promised Peter Eckhorn, who was the manager of the Top 10, that we would come back and we'd play there. And what was happening in Liverpool, it was dance halls, and we felt that the opportunity we had in Hamburg, right, playing in a club as a residential band, was something which wasn't going on in Liverpool. Right, we were playing great, we were playing 7 nights a week. You know, a lot of other bands are only playing once or twice a week. But going back there and playing under one roof and being in the public eye all the time, and you know, because Hamburg was fast becoming a music city, you know, so as well as Liverpool, a lot of people in Hamburg, you know, as regards the record industry and the fact that the bands were from Liverpool, were starting to take an interest in, you know, what we would call English music or English artists that were appearing over there. So it seemed sense to go back. And as it so happened, you know, second trip back, Bird Kempford signed us up, which was great for us.
They were quite unusual at the time because they actually had a sort of inbuilt songwriting team in Lennon and McCartney. And I mean, the point about that John and Paul writing songs together was that, you know, if the Beatles did go sour on them, that they were going to try and make it as songwriters. This was at a time when there was a very definite demarcation line between artists and songwriters.
At the time of the sort of Beatles started sort of writing with particularly John and Paul, though George had written earlier, it was so unusual because at the time there were songwriters. In America it was all the songwriters, Coffin and King, Leiber and Stoll, all these people in the Brill Building. Songwriters wrote the songs, artists performed them. And it was the same in sort of Britain with people like Mitch Murray, who provided the number that was supposed to be done by the Beatles. Artists didn't really write, and also you had all the if they didn't have an original song by a songwriter, they covered an American song in Britain. You know, they're all the cover versions. But with Lennon and McCartney, that's really sparked it off, and that led to the whole aspect of all artists creating their own songs in the future.
We've been playing the top 10. We were at the top 10 for about 3 months, and round about middle of May, end of May, we were told by Peter Reckhorn that Bert Kempfert, who was the biggest A&R man in Germany at that time, with Polydor Records, was interested. People had seen the band, fed it back to him, and he was interested in seeing it for himself. And he came down and watched us a couple of times, but we always got the tip-off from the manager of the club when he was in the audience. So, you know, it was like Bert Kemper's in the audience, away we'd go. Or do some of the choice numbers, you know, to impress him. But he was impressed with the band anyway. You liked the harmonies, you liked Sheridan, you liked the combination of the, you know, the two together, and the fact that he could record Tony by himself and the Beatles by themselves. So one particular night, at the end of the night, he turned around and called us over, and in a nutshell basically turned around and said, you know, love to record you, you know, love to sign you up. We'll set a date, you know, where you're going to record in Germany for the Polydor label. And that date was set, you know, for sometime in June, you know, just before we left. And of course, over those 2 days, 2 or 3 days that we were there, My Bonnie came to fruition, and Cry for a Shadow and Ain't She Sweet, which are household names now in the music industry. We'd already turned around and said we were Polydor recording artists. Right, that was a big word on the grapevine, because one of the first bands to be signed up in Liverpool. Okay, it didn't matter that it was a German label, it was the biggest German label, right? And of course, it was great for the posters and the publicity and everything else. And, you know, the crowd, which was great, you know, they wanted us back. We'd been away 3 months. You know, and their favourite band, or one of the favourite bands, you know, was coming back home again. They were going to be playing the local scenes, they were going to be playing the Casbah, they were going to be playing the Cavern, you know, the local haunts. They were back in the vicinity again. You know, the kids in Liverpool could see them, not just hear about them. But of course, what we came back with was a record under our belt. And it was like, you know, we hyped that up as much as we could. You know, This Is My Bonnie, which we recorded, you know, Cavern, Casbah, Polydor recording artists, signed. So it was great, because, I mean, we were what, 1961, 1920, 1920. We came back a foursome because Stu had decided he was going to go back to Hamburg College of Art. So that was a little bit of a shock for some people in Liverpool. They were expecting to see Stu come back again. But, you know, it wasn't that it made any difference to the band. It was still powerhouse, it was still prolific, they were still hearing the same songs, still getting belted out the same, you know, energetic fashion. And to be quite honest, the kids didn't care. You know, it was the fact the Beatles were back no matter what lineup it was. And we just rose from strength to strength. And consequently, as a result of that, you know, a certain fella called Brian Epstein right, started to take interest.
It would be very nice to say that Brian Epstein had a great business mind and thought, I can make something out of these boys. But I've got a feeling his interest was rather more personal than that, and he was attracted to these slightly rough young working class lads in leather trousers and so on, particularly for trousers. I'm sure that was the thing that first aroused his interest, so to speak. After that, he'd been looking for a career away from the family business. He was stuck in Liverpool running the Epstein family firm called NEMS, North End Music Stores. And he was a frustrated theatrical. His family had been very much against him trying to sort of strike out on his own. And I think when he found the Beatles, and once he calmed down enough, had a cold shower, he started to think, oh, maybe there is something in this rock and roll lark. And it became his personal crusade. He had no experience at all as a pop manager. He had no idea how the music business worked. But he set out, it was his sort of lifelong dream, to make stars out of these boys. And by sheer hard work, he did it.
When he was thinking of managing them, he came round and asked, because he knew my association. And my reply was, I said, don't touch them with a fucking barge pole. But obviously he didn't. Obviously he didn't listen. Thank God, yeah.
We knew he was there because other people turned around and said he'd stood in the shadows and watched from afar. The message was passed via Bob Wooler, who was the cabin DJ, so we knew that he had been there, and it was like, I'd like to see the Beatles, you know, in the afternoon, well, you know, during office hours. But he didn't actually send that message to us in person. It was passed on, and we said, okay, we'll go for a couple of pints first, which we normally would after a dinner time session, and then stroll down the road to Nems and, you know, go and see Brian. And he talked around, and be quite honest, he was very fair about it, right? He said, you know, heard a lot about you, seen you actually perform, like what you're doing, like the charisma of the band, the way the band handles themselves. I'm interested in going into managing a band. I've never done it before. Let's give it a go. No strings attached. If it works, fine. If it doesn't work, we'll all walk. So we said, yeah, seems fair enough. You know, we said, okay, we're going to talk it over amongst ourselves. Chatted it out with our parents, which you'd normally do anyway, a decision like this. And when we all, you know, the big consensus of opinion was, okay, yeah, you know, it's Brian Epstein, he's manager of NEMS, you know, he's rich, drives a big white car, wears a suit, you know, very respectable, well thought of, good contacts with the record companies, etc., etc., etc. Yeah, we'll give it a go. And, you know, we went back and turned around and told Brian, yeah, we'll sign with you, you know. But as we turned around and said, you know, if it doesn't work, you know, you go your way and we'll go ours. But as the world knows now, you know, what did he do for him? Made him the biggest phenomenon in the world, yeah.
All the work had been done by me and Mona. They were a ready-made product when he took them over. They were already the rage of Liverpool. All they needed was a rich manager. And of course they got him.
In terms of what Brian did, is, he made them acceptable as best he could. They were still little rogues in the real life. They looked smart and presentable. They didn't swear on stage anymore, didn't smoke on stage anymore. And he was the only person that at the time could have turned them into what they were. He was the only person with that perseverance. You know, that anyone else that had managed or been involved with them had just given up, or they didn't have the ambition to crack them out of that. And without Brian, the Beatles might never have cracked out of Liverpool, you know, because other proper managers, you say, like Larry Parnes and who managed, you know, the Billy Furies and those people, they'd all seen the Beatles and just paid no attention to them. Just sort of, you know, they hadn't collared what they were all about.
I mean, let's be quite honest. Certain things which he did initially, certain of us weren't happy with, but I mean, at the end of the day, you've got to remember that, you know, I suppose the easiest way of saying it is that he'd got a rough diamond, right? He got this priceless carat of diamond there, and he had to polish it, right? And he turned around and said, you know, I like the way you go on stage, but I want you to be more professional. And he started to groom us. You know, that's the word for it, groom. And, you know, it was like, hang on a minute, where you'd been drinking and smoking on stage. It was like, that's out. Where we'd done, you know, we perform a show or something like that, we'd never have a set list, right? We'd just fire off one another. You know, what number are you doing next? Oh, we'll do so-and-so, that's fine. You know, crowd love it, they're happy, yeah, we're happy, right? He introduced set list, right? Times that we had to be at venues. Right? Not rolling up 5 minutes before and, you know, with a pie in your hand or something like this. And then, of course, the big thing with him was he put us into suits, which was we lived in leathers for 2 years, right? So John and myself were a little bit obnoxious about the thought of going into suits, but we followed suit. We came to a compromise, you know. Certain venues would wear the suits, other venues would wear the leathers. Till eventually, you know, as they know now, you know, the Beatles suits and the Beatle hairstyle, you know, became fashion. But he started to groom us. And what we wanted was an English recording contract. That was the big thing. We had this recording contract in Germany because of the sheer economics of it, having to go over there, record. We felt, now hang on a minute, there's, you know, recording companies in England, Decca, EMI, you know, you name it, Decca being the biggest. Let's try and get a deal with them. And that was the mission which, you know, we gave Brian.
It all started really for me when Brian Epstein wrote, not to me personally, I'd already moved to London from Liverpool, and I was working at Decca Records as, I think, the only full-time sleeve note writer, liner notes on the back of albums. I think I was the only one in Britain. But I was also doing, as a sideline, the Liverpool Echo record column, which I'd been doing since sixth form school days. And he wrote to me at the Liverpool Echo under my nom de plume that I'd written under. And to his surprise, got a letter back from somebody named Tony Barrow in London. And he came to see me, and he at Decca, and he brought with him an acetate, a demo disc, that he said had been made by a television company who were making a documentary about the Beatles at the Cavern Club. And he said that this acetate had been taken from their soundtrack, and that's why it was poor quality. It was only many years later that I discovered that this was a little white lie, because what he'd actually done and why it was poor quality is that he had stood in the middle of the cavern with a very old, what today would be an antique Philips cassette tape recorder, and held a mic in the air and got the sound from around him. Well, the sound of the Cavern Club that he had captured was great. You could get the sort of electrifying feeling, the ambience of this place, the excitement of it, but you certainly couldn't really tell very much about his band. You couldn't tell what the Beatles were like as such. And I kind of did a don't call us, we'll call you thing on him at Decca, but it wasn't my place to do that. I mean, I wasn't there to hire or fire the talent. I was there to write these liner notes, sleeve notes for the albums. But I really didn't see that what he'd got there was anything special from what he had played to me. But when he left Decca, I picked up the internal phone and rang not the production department, not the producers, not the artists people at all, but the marketing department at Decca on the internal phone, because I knew that Brian Epstein had record shops in Liverpool. And at first the people in the marketing department sort of said, no, Epstein, no, don't know that name. Is that the name of the shops? And I said, no, the shops are called NEMS, North End Music Stores. Immediately the marketing department sprang to attention and saluted and said, NEMS, one of our greatest customers in the northwest of England, this band has to have an audition.
When we went to Decca and auditioned at Decca, right, we were in a studio for the audition. You know, this was an audition, it was a very important audition. as Brian went to great bones to tell us about before we went down there. You know, you must go to bed early, and of course, at 2:30 in the morning, we're in the middle of Trafalgar Square, doing certain things which we shouldn't be doing, and got to the session hungover. But yeah, I mean, it was New Year's Day. The excitement was there. We played about 14 or 15 numbers. Not our choice. I mean, that if there's one thing which I'd turn around and say about Brian, was the choice of material he made us play on that particular day didn't do us any justice. I can see that the wisdom in it was that he wanted to show Decca the cross-section of material we could do, from out-and-out rockers to grey harmonies to country and western to original material. But as Mike Smith turned around and said, what he actually saw in the cabin didn't come over studio-wise.
Dick Rowe, who was much maligned because he turned down the Beatles, and very unfairly, he played me the tapes once, and I don't know if anybody else has said this, but the tapes were absolute crap. They were rubbish. They were bad covers of old rock songs. But I heard the patter on the tape and the personalities of the Beatles, and the personalities were far stronger than the music, and if it had been up to me, I would have put them in the studio again and persevered with them, because the personalities were so strong even in those days.
We thought that we had Decca's contract in the bag. You know, final words from Mike Smith were, don't worry lads, we even went out and celebrated, you know, St. John's Wood, big lavish dinner, on Brian of course. But, you know, the wine was flowing, etc., etc. We all came back in high spirits, and then a couple of weeks afterwards we were turned around and told, you know, on a bummer, Decca turned you down. They signed Mike Poole and the Tremolos. So that, to us, was like red rag to a bull. And it was, okay, Brian, coin an expression, get it back on your bike again and, you know, get us a contract.
Obviously, all the A&R people got bollocked because they had turned down the Beatles, and Sir Edward Lewis wanted to know where the next big group was coming from.
The myth down the years has been that all the other record companies in London turned down the Beatles. Well, what they actually turned down was that same disastrous Decca audition tape, because that's the only ammunition that Brian Epstein had at the time. And Brian went round the record companies hawking this one audition tape of sort of badly recorded material. And I must confess, I didn't hear those recordings until much later. But if I had been a producer, I would not have contracted the Beatles on the evidence of that particular audition. It was not a good session.
And as we know now, Decca being the biggest company, he took the tapes from Decca and he hawked them around London, all the record companies, and he wasn't getting on. They weren't biting. Till someone heard them, and cut a long story short because it's well chronicled, it caught the ear, or gave someone the interest to actually bring it to George Martin.
Well, I mean, we have to go back to the very first. It was called an artist test. Now, I was sitting at the controls waiting for them to come in. It was an afternoon session, if I remember rightly. The door opened and in walked George Martin himself. And I thought, oh, this is going to be some sort of special artist test. It's the first time the main producer has ever arrived.
There were problems, actually. I mean, okay, we were a little bit blasé, I'll be quite honest. When you look back in hindsight, we were the Beatles, and you know, we're the biggest thing since sliced bread. Even though we weren't the phenomenon, but that was, you know, we're from Liverpool, we had that Liverpool arrogance. And when we got to EMI at Abbey Road, we went into Studio 2 and we just set up like we normally do.
It wasn't very impressive at all, but I liked them. You know, their bits of their humour was coming out, particularly John and Paul. And George, well, he was a bit of an introvert anyway, George. So anyway, you know, they weren't impressive at all. So George said, well, I think we better bring George Martin, better bring them up. So we did, we brought them up, and then George Martin started to address them to say what he was looking for and what they got to do. We were looking for certain songs and, you know, the way they treat it and head arrangements and all that kind of thing. Then he handed them over to me, and they went on about the equipment, you know, and I suggested certain equipment that they got to get, including Pete Best's cymbals, you know, all that sort of thing. And anyway, went on for about 20 minutes, this, dressing them down, sermonising. And then at the end, George Martin said to them, he said, well, look, we've been having a go at you for some time. Is there anything you want to say to us? They just stood there, silence, nothing. And they were looking George up and down, looking me up and down. Nothing at all. Then all of a sudden, it was George Harrison looking at George Martin. He said, yeah, I don't like your tie, he said. And, you know, I nearly fell off my chair, laughing. Tears were running down my face, and then some more humour came out, you know. And anyway, eventually they left the control room, left George and I there. I was wiping the tears away from my face, and George said to me, well, what do you think? So I said, well, I've never seen anything. I've tested quite a number of these guitar groups. I've never seen anything like these guys. I know what we've heard today is, you know, pretty rubbishy, I said, but
the usual thing, you know, with handling the business side before. There'd been business meetings, and it was very much a case, Pete, I want to see you in the office in the morning. And I thought, yeah, okay, it's another, you know, chew the fat one, talk about promoters, should we put the price up, what's this venue like? Usual stuff you talked about. And I said, okay. So I said, yeah, get there about 10:30. So I said, yeah, that's fine. Jumped in the van with Neil, came home, he dropped me off the next morning at Nems. He turned around and said, I'll wait for you, Pete. So I said, yeah, you know, only be a couple of minutes. And went in, and I could tell that Brian was very aggravated and anxious. And he talked around the subject for a while, and then he just turned around and said, Pete, he said, I don't really know how to turn around and tell you this. He said, the boys want you out, and it's already been arranged. And I think that was the key word, already been arranged, that Ringo would join the band on Saturday. And this was either Wednesday or Thursday. And that was the bombshell, you know. So when you walk in Copper Hoop, not expecting anything, because there'd been no forewarning or, you know, we're not happy with you in the band or anything like this. When you're confronted with that, to be quite honest, your brain was scrambled. But it was only when I got back home again that the true force of the dismissal hit me. You know, when I walked out again, Neil was in the van, and he went, what's happened? And I went, I've been kicked out. And he just went, I don't believe it. And we didn't say anything until we got back home again.